What makes old Malbec vines planted in the 1920s so rare and valuable today? Why would a Canadian winemaker head to Mendoza, Argentina to start a winery? And what's one of the biggest challenges holding back Canadian wine, and how can consumers like us change that? In today's episode, you'll hear the stories and tips that answer those questions in part 2 of our chat with Ann Sperling and Peter Gamble. This power couple of the Canadian winemaking world has so many awesome insights to share. If you didn't listen to part 1 from last week yet, don't worry. Listen to this episode, then go back and take a listen to that one. By the end of our conversation, you'll also discover what makes On 7 Winery's Devotion Chardonnay different from other wines, how Ann and Peter decided on a particular vineyard to purchase in Argentina after looking at 230 of them, what massal selection means in viticulture. It's important, technical, but very important. Aspects of Malbec that are similar to Pinot Noir, I never thought of it this way, how Ann and Peter have revitalized Leily Winery, the differences and similarities between Leily and On 7 Chardonnays, what Ann and Peter would like their legacies to be in the Canadian wine industry, the greatest threats facing the industry, the 3 key figures in the industry that Peter and Ann would invite to their dream dinner party. Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my 3rd book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 343. So continuing with our lead up to Canada Day, I wanted to share my segments on CTV Morning Live Vancouver and CTV Morning Live Alberta, which broadcast on Monday and Tuesday this week. We focused on the stories behind some incredible wines from British Columbia. We're kicking off with the Poplar Grove Cascadia Series Pinot Gris from Penticton. It's bursting with aromas of fresh lime and lemon sunshine, and I'd pair it with Pacific Coast salmon, either grilled or smoked. This is the 30th anniversary for this family-owned winery. Tony and Bob Holler and their 4 sons run the winery, which practices sustainable viticulture with hand-harvested grapes, low-intervention winemaking, and solar power. The family created Cascadia Series out of necessity following the severe frosts of 2024 that devastated BC vineyards. To continue bringing exceptional wines to their customers, they sourced premium grapes from just across the border in Washington state. And despite the origin of the fruit, every other part of this wine's journey, from fermentation to bottling, aging, and packaging, happened in BC, critically maintaining those jobs for those who work in this winery and those who depend on it. You can buy this wine and all of the other wines I'm recommending directly from the winery's websites, or just give them a call. They'll ship the wines right to your doorstep. This is a really important way that you can support these small family farms as they depend on direct sales to survive. Also consider visiting these wineries for your next vacation or weekend getaway, as they all have beautiful tasting rooms with food pairings and tours in spectacular settings. Next up, I have the Vicente Estate Winery Gamay Noir, a silky smooth medium-bodied red from Oliver, British Columbia, with aromas of bright red cherries and a touch of spice. It's perfect for savory summer salads and soft cheeses. The word Vicente means renewal and growth, which captures the Sidhu family's story. Their father arrived in Canada in 1980 with just a few dollars in his pocket and built one of the province's most successful farming operations. Today, his 3 sons, Devinder, Vic, and Gordy, carry on that spirit with their top-tier wines. They're all deeply involved in every aspect of the winery. Devinder, a biochemist and optometrist, has published research on cool climate viticulture, which brings additional depth and precision to the winemaking process. Versado has multiple medals at the All-Canadian Wine Awards and was a top 10 finalist for Best New Winery. Next, we're moving on to the Clos du Soleil Signature Red from the Similkameen Valley in British Columbia. This winery specializes in Bordeaux blends of Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, Malbec, and Petit Verdot. Bold, structured, and beautifully balanced. Essentially, this wine is the liquid embodiment of the Canadian Rockies. This wine won the silver medal at the International Wine and Spirits Competition in London, England, and was awarded 91 points out of 100. They farm organically and biodynamically, letting the rocky soils and mountain sunshine through in every sip. This is the kind of wine that tells a story that's elegant yet powerful, like the landscape it comes from. Try it with a steak, or grilled portobello mushrooms, or aged cheddar. I also have the bold, savory Township 7 Winery Provenance Series Cabernet Sauvignon. It offers seductive aromas of dark plums and juicy blackberries. It's smooth and full-bodied, perfect for barbecue steak or blue cheese. Township 7 is celebrating their 25th anniversary and is one of the few BC wineries with 2 locations, South Langley and the Naramata Bench. They produce still and sparkling wines in small artisanal lots, and their wines have consistently been awarded 90-point scores and lots of awards. Over the decade, Township 7 has become a leader in traditional methods sparkling wines. The 7 Stars collection has earned them multiple top honors, including Best Canadian Sparkling Wine at the Champagne and Sparkling Wine World Championships, platinum and double gold medals at the All-Canadian Wine Championships, and many others. After one of the most challenging years in the Okanagan history with that 2024 freeze, they're replanting their vineyards and in the meantime have introduced their Interlude series made from Sonoma grapes. It's a true testament to Canadian resilience and optimism. When nature gives you frost, you continue to give it your all. For our final wine, we have a gorgeous late-harvest dessert wine from Sagewood Estate Winery in Kamloops. The Dernier Fauche is bursting with luscious dark cherry and blackberry jam flavors. I'd pair it with blackberry pie or even chocolate mousse as it's rich enough to handle it. This is pure decadence in a glass and a great reason to skip dinner entirely. Sagewood is a boutique family-owned winery nestled on the slopes of the scenic South Thompson River. This is the region's oldest commercial vineyard. Winemaker Doug Wood has been growing grapes since 2005 and started bottling wine under his own label in 2013. Since then, Sagewood has won more than 60 medals and awards. All right, and you can find all of those wines on my website, of course, at nataliemaclean.com. I'm also reviewing and sharing these and others on Instagram at Natalie MacLean Wine, so join me there. I have 1 copy left of the award-winning book Vines in a Cold Climate, About English Wine by Henry Jeffries to give away, 3 copies of the hilarious book, it really is funny, I bought it so I'll drink it, and 2 copies of the memoir Grape Expectations, A Family's Vineyard Adventure in France. If you'd like to win a copy, please email me and let me know. It doesn't matter where you live. I'll choose 6 winners randomly from those who contact me at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. They'd be wonderful for your own summer reading, or give one as a gift to a friend. In other bookish news, if you're reading the paperback or ebook or listening to the audiobook of my memoir, Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much, a national bestseller and one of Amazon's best books of the year, I'd love to hear from you at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. I'd be happy to send you beautifully designed, personally signed book plates for the copies you buy or give as gifts. I'll put a link in the show notes to all retailers worldwide at nataliemaclean.com/343. Okay, on with the show. All right, I think we should taste some of these wines. Lots of talk, but you've got from on 7, you have the wines that I have as well, the 2 Chardonnays, the Pursuit and Devotion. So we get more of an idea, again, the theme here in terms of what you're aiming for. Do you want to tell us about the Pursuit? And let's taste as we do.
Sure. So these are both the 21, and it's the vintage we were referencing earlier, coincidentally.
Yeah.
So a cooler year, actually relatively warm in August, but then as Ann said, rain continued quite thoroughly through a lot of parts of the harvest. And we talked already earlier about what we'd done with the Pinot in terms of moving to Rosé. But in fact, with the Pursuit and with the Devotion, with the Chardonnay that year, we took a percentage of the blocks for that and moved it off into a sparkling wine. Same kind of principle as with the Rosé. We were looking at numbers in the vineyard and flavors in the vineyard that were really conducive to the production of a good Blanc de Blanc Chardonnay and weren't so perfect with regard to our target of producing a richer, more intense, more voluptuous and structured kind of Côte de Blanc approach with the Chardonnay. And so we took off those sections of those blocks that we felt would be best for the sparkling, went ahead and made the production on that. Then later, always later, make decisions on what we're going to move into the 2 tiers, right? And so there are potentially 3 within the context in our original business plan on 7, but they're the 2 so far from any of the given years. So the Pursuit is the one, and then the higher tier is the Devotion. And we make those decisions a lot of times based on barrel. We do wild fermentations. The wild fermentations always mean significant differences in the barrels during the fermentations because they can all be a little bit different. That's true also the malolactic fermentation that follows. That'll also be wild with us, and that'll have some impact as well from barrel to barrel and some differences. So barrel selection becomes quite important in that, and we'll often pay attention to which clones and which blocks are going in which direction during the processing. So we have that as an option too for the selection.
And so for the third as yet to be produced tier, is that going to be like Obsession, Compulsion? What is that going to be named?
Hey, you should be marketing for us. I think we'll have to talk about this.
Yeah. Mania, I don't know. So let's taste this and you tell me what you're getting from it. I'm just getting all sorts of happiness and rich, lovely. I want to hear from you though.
So it's a younger wine. I always preface with that. We release a little bit older than many wineries do. So, here it is, 25, and we're tasting a 21, which was just released last year. It's still young, and it's intended to be. We make the wines for ageability. It's an important part of what we're doing. And it's an important part of classic Burgundian style winemaking.
It's beautiful to me, my untrained palate like yours. It's tasting beautifully now. Will it just get sort of nuttier as it ages, or what'll happen?
So I like the sort of velvety feel in the middle of it in the texture, and yet the finish still has bright acidity that shows you the ageability of the wine. A hazelnut note, I think, comes from the reduction part of the process. The wines are never fruity within the context of things. We joke sometimes about, surfboard Chardonnays that are, California, and those kind of sort of derogatory notes about emphasizing fruit. I remember for a long time when Ann and I judged at the California State Fair, we'd have the discussion of fruit quite often on Chardonnay, on other grapes too. There were those that often proposed there was no such thing as too much fruit, to which we often respond, well, you should just buy the grapes. You'd save a lot of money, right? And so the attempt here is to reflect the terroir and the style and what happens in that area, and again, within the context of Burgundian interpretation. And so a richer area, super low cropping levels. I mean, Vittorio and Sula are comfortable to go down to, sometimes a ton an acre, a ton and a half an acre of volume. So you're getting all of the concentration from the sun and the terroir, the soils and the minerals into a very small quantity of grapes.
And how would that compare to a larger commercial operation, whether it's in Canada or even California? How many tons are they taking in of grapes?
In the Central Valley in California, for example, as an extreme where, they irrigate and crop as much as they can and they have, excess sunshine, you can reach as much as 15 or 20 tons per acre.
Wow.
The norm in Napa would be on Chardonnay, probably 4 to 5, on Pinot, maybe 3 to 4.
So this is small, so everything's concentrated in those little berries, which translates into the wine of concentration and depth.
Absolutely. And it wouldn't be different to, the Grand Cru in the very top end in Burgundy, where those quantities are also very small.
Yeah, these are beautiful. It just that's what came to me first was the nuttiness. Definitely not fruit, but it's just so, and the mouthfeel, to use a technical term or cliche, but
It's a
yeah.
really interesting property. And one of the things we like about it and about great vineyards in general is that very often, regardless of some variations in the vintage, the terroir of the vineyard will come out. So we find that, for example, during fermentation, a lot of wines from a similar region and variety can taste quite similar. And then as they gain 1 or 2 or 3 months age and the yeast and the fermentation aromatics come off, and you start to sense more the vineyard and the source of it, you get that kind of intensity and that particular characteristics that will show a vineyard. And by the time it's 7, 8, 9, 10 months out, and even more so later, they'll all begin to taste like, oh, this is the on 7. Like it's just that vineyard has a very specific note, and we love it for that.
So from chewing on spinach and bark, you've got to project forward where this is going to be in a year, 10 years, 20 years. Wow, that's something to be able to
Canadian
do that.
Thing, where the puck's going to be as opposed to where it is.
Exactly. Very Canadian. So I'd love to dwell longer on each wine, but I want to get through these wines, and we've got some others to taste. So here's the Devotion, which is your step up from that. What makes these two wines different?
Barrel selection. So with the harvesting on that small property is 1 day. So each variety might be on a different day, but to harvest Chardonnay, we have to decide, what's the perfect day. And we bring it all in the morning and process it in the afternoon. But as Peter mentioned, we ferment in barrels. So those are 225 liter or 300 bottle lots. But after about 18 months to 20 months of aging, we go back to those barrels and taste them individually. And then that's really where winemaking comes into the picture. There's all the things, the steps that you do and the plan that you make, but it's taking those results and then bringing them together, crafting those blends. So we usually taste together on that, but in these particular wines, Peter gets the final say on which barrels go into which lot, with the goal of having the Devotion being, I'll say, a little tighter, a little more restrained.
I was going to say it's compact, not concentrated, but it's like gathered in, but it's like a coiled spring ready to,
Yeah, exactly.
when it gets older.
Yeah, for that ageability and also, just for a longer, slower evolution.
Wow, this is beautiful. It's only tasting them side by side that obviously you can see the difference, but that's quite something. You can see, again, the signature, but wow.
Even the color differential on the 21, a little richer color on the Devotion for sure. Definitely a little more hazelnut, a little more concentration on the finish, and a little more length, going out too. It's, we're happy with where that's gone for sure.
Oh, that does remind me. I have to share this with you. I visited Anne Leflèvre in Burgundy, and she took me down to her barrel cellar, and she had an open bottle, and the wine was poured. And it was just the most amazing thing. And then she told me it had been open 3 days. That's what the Devotion reminds me of. It's just this life and this, I don't know, I'm going to use all sorts of weird metaphors, but this really brings back Burgundy to me, especially the Devotion.
That's great.
Yeah.
We've noticed that in the comments of some of the writers as well. Tony Asper made a point of saying, this is very Montrachet-like about this particular wine. That makes us very happy, again, because we work within the context of those are definitely our drivers in terms of, our targets and where we like to see them. So it's great that it even echoes it.
Well done. More than an echo, for sure. All right. So is there anything else you wanted to say about On 7 before we move on to Versado?
I just sort of encapsulate the conversation on 7. It's a really small vineyard. It allows us to work with a lot of detail. We like the theory that we had initially about going for a little bit of extra heft and intensity and weight, as per, Meursault as opposed to Chablis as the earlier part of the discussion. And I think that's a big part of where we came from. But we were delighted to see the capabilities of Niagara on the Lake to develop the concentration and that kind of terroir. And I think that's an important discussion amongst winemakers. So I had a winemaker I admire, for example, got back to us and said, whoa, that's a really great example of a Burgundian interpretation out of Niagara-on-the-Lake. It's good to see that the Niagara-on-the-Lake soils could accomplish that. And it was a bit of guesswork, of course, with us when we initially looked at it and whether we felt it could do that. And I think our choice of rootstock, going with a rootstock that has been completely overlooked over about the last 25 years because it's capable of producing big crops. And so people stay away from it in order to do small crops. But if you choose it, those roots go really, really, really deep into the soil. They have the biggest sort of root structure of anything out there, and then still choose to do very careful viticulture on, above the ground in order to reduce the crop yourselves, but bring all of that energy and all of that vigor up from the ground. I think that's a big part of how we captured the terroir of Niagara-on-the-Lake in this wine. So,
absolutely. And is there a Pinot Noir in production?
Yes. There's 23 and 24 in barrels. So, Peter keeps talking about the small production. And, for sure, Pinot Noir is still a smaller part of the overall. But for those dedicated wine club, fans, they're going to get some Pinot Noir, relatively soon. I won't say it's this year because we haven't bottled the 23s yet, but they're definitely coming along, and we're really excited about them. So it's it's a sign up and get your allocation annually kind of situation.
Yeah, because it's such a small production. Yeah. So it's available from the website. Is it on7wines.ca?
Yes. Yeah.
We'll put a link in the show notes so that people can find them. Support your local producers. Absolutely. All right, let's move on to Versado. What inspired you to look beyond Canada to Argentina for winemaking? What drew you to Argentina itself?
I was down there on business, but back in the days of doing VQA, and we were negotiating with the world, the French really more than anyone, about quality wine standards and what Canadian wine standards had to be in order to be accepted for trade purposes internationally. So I was with a group that did those kind of discussions on an international level. And we visited a lot of wine regions in the world for the meetings, both fun and a necessity. And one of them was Mendoza. Love the climate, love the fact that it's cold at night with the cool wind coming down off the glaciers in the mountains, and then can be 35 degrees during the day. So a really interesting climate from the point of view of creating flavors in grapes, and really liked the lifestyle as well there, largely Italian and Spanish influence. Yeah, about 50-50 in Mendoza. And so I liked it. And then Anne got invited down a little bit later as part of a French winemaking consultation team that spent some time there. Also loved it. We essentially decided it would be interesting to do something small there. Also gives us a second harvest during the year, so we can practice twice as often.
It's the opposite seasons because it's in the southern hemisphere. So your fall or your harvest is in March, is it?
Yeah. Normally March. Occasionally sneaks into April. Yeah.
Yeah, don't think about taking any time off. Like, why would you?
There are big spaces between, no? So it's
okay, all right.
Yeah. So that was the driver. We weren't that happy with a lot of the Malbec that was being produced there. We felt that it was, a lot of them were like chocolate bars, big, sweet, heavy, too concentrated, too full, too monolithic, not complex, lacking the layers that they could have. And so we felt that was an important part of what we wanted to try and do as well.
And what made you decide this vineyard was the one, so to speak, after 230 evaluations?
Yeah, that was the big part of it. It was the decision, can we find something of that kind of caliber? And it's more difficult to buy from outside, even though we had people from inside doing both the consultation on what to buy, helping us source them while we weren't there, those that might be available for sale, and providing some guidance in terms of what might be best and what was worth looking at. It's a really broad area. As you get high up the mountains, you're producing 1 ton an acre. When you get down even 10 kilometers away to the lower parts of the flats, as you move out of the foothills, you can be producing 15 or 20 tons an acre of wine that you can sell at $2 a bottle.
Because the colder it gets, the less the grapes can ripen or survive. Is that kind of what's
And the
going
more
on?
mountainous the soils, so rockier soils and more barren soils, they're not as productive as the rich soils that have been washed down off the hillsides into the valleys underneath. And so, differences on a number of those fronts. And of course, temperature, you mentioned much cooler as you're closer to the glaciers and higher up. So big differences there. So we had a lot of things to look at and to understand. That's where the consultation with the likes of Roberto de la Mata, who was our primary consultant on viticulture and on winemaking as we began that project. And so it was a different climate for us, for sure, even than the south end of the Okanagan, and much different than Nova Scotia and Ontario. The hunt became the important part, and we paid a lot of attention, tasted a lot of wine, tasted neighbors' wines, tasted previous wines from that vineyard until we finally nailed something in an area, surprisingly, that Roberto had identified right out of the gates as the absolute sweet spot, on which we'd almost given up, thinking that no one from outside of the country was going to be able to buy anything in that particular area, and finally lucked out.
Yeah, well, and a certain moment, the universe spoke to us. So we had to, we couldn't ignore it at that point, right?
The universe said, make a decision, will you?
Well, no, it wasn't. It wasn't just that. And that it relates to a much earlier experience that Peter had with Malbec.
So the story Ann's leading up to is one of the earliest days in my winemaking, what's now Trias at Hildebrand, was I was judging at a competition in Toronto. And it was the Intervent competition by Andrew Sharp, which folded not long after that. But in the very early days of that, I was on a tasting panel with Tony Aspler, Lloyd Evans, and Dave Lorison, right? So all, many still, active members in the industry. And we had a blind tasting. We don't know what we're tasting. And at that time, when you're judging, when you're giving a double gold, that's because everybody's judged it individually as a gold without conversation with any of the other judges. And so it's a little different than now. Most competitions now allow you to discuss at the end and then decide what the medal is going to be. But a double gold at that time meant that. And we were tasting these two wines in this flight that had identified by 4 digits. And we're tasting them, and we all gave them gold. And as we passed them in, we're then allowed to talk. We're all, well, what were those wines? Like the two wines, very similar in style, really interesting, fabulous texture. Seemed like Bordeaux-esque varieties, but more elegant, almost Pinot-like, some barnyard notes that are more Pinot-esque, some things that really made it fascinating. And we'd all really loved the wines. And so we asked later, by digit, Andrew, what were these wines? And it turned out that it was the re-entry, essentially, of Argentina into the international wine world of competition. Prior to that, they made wine, really average wines, for local consumption. And they were the largest consumers in the world, right up with France and Spain in terms of annual consumption, and Italy. So not a lot of it was done abroad, and not a lot of it was top end. This turned out to be, we found out from Winard, a producer that had just begun and had hired Raul de la Mata, Roberto's father, a great winemaker, studied in France, became legendary both there and in Argentina, who was the winemaker of this wine. And so this story is becoming even longer, but in tasting those wines, we were really amazed at what they were and how they tasted and everything. And so years and years later, 25 years later, 30 years later, I'm now driving around in Argentina after having looked at a couple hundred vineyards and not having found the ones we want. I get an indication on a phone call while I'm driving that there's a small vineyard for sale in bankruptcy, in what turns out to be pretty close to the sweet spot. So I get quickly onto the phone with Roberto and say, describe it to him, say where it is. It's just off Branson Road. It's on Cobos, the legendary high road of Argentina where old Malbec is famous. I'm sort of describing it to him as I'm driving along. He says, okay, you cross Branson. And he says, is there a soccer pitch on the right? I said, yeah, there is. And he says, at the next vineyard. And I look at the number on it, and sure enough, that's the number of the vineyard. And he says, I know that wine. He says, my dad used that wine back in the 78 from Viner, right? Which is just like.
So that was the wine you were tasting in the competition?
Exactly. Yeah. So this is 30 years later, and it was used in that proposition. And when it was Viner.
It was meant to be.
They actually still have a barrel of the 2008, the year before we bought it, in tonneau, in the cellar of Vineyard as we speak, kept separately from the rest of the production. It hasn't been bottled yet. Yeah.
Can Malbec age that?
Oh yeah,
That well?
absolutely.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
think
Yeah.
you'll see.
Obviously, you think so. Yeah, because
Yeah.
you're making Versado now. Wow, that is
So
so cool.
that's one of the background stories on it. And again, we were just lucky to get something in that area eventually after having to look for so long. It's location, location, location. It's super high, 980 meters. Of the old vines, it was as high as you get. We're organic, and we're at the very top of the water supply coming in, melting off the glaciers. So we don't need to worry about the chemicals that have been used above us because we're the first to receive the water.
Yeah, you can get
Yeah,
runoff, and
so
that really
yeah,
impacts if you're trying to do
yeah,
organic.
so very
But you
important in
don't
that
have to do
regard
that.
too, and a lot of other things that were just, as Ann said, the universe spoke to us. This had to be the spot. So yeah,
Absolutely. Let's keep talking about Versado while we taste. Shall we do the 2019
sure,
first?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Because the vines pre-phylloxera, like, were not affected by, you said they're ancient vines. Were they planted in the 1920s?
Yeah, 1920. So Argentina, their wine industry took a lot of lessons from the French, and they're very bureaucratic, so which can be really annoying at times, but it also means that they've had a really good system for registering their vineyards. And so our vineyard was planted in 1920. At that time, Malbec was still quite recent. It was known back then as the French grape. It was being like broadly planted, but with a lot of diversity in the vineyards. Even some people feel that seedlings were being experimented with from Malbec, which is very diverse. So this is a massal planting, it's own rooted.
Let me just interject there, if you don't mind, because I had to look this up, Ann, and correct me, because I think listeners would like to know what that means. Massal selection is a traditional viticulture practice where new vines are propagated using the cuttings or buds taken from a diverse group of healthy, exceptional existing vines from a vineyard or nearby. And unlike clonal selection, which multiplies a single genetically identical vine, massal selection involves selecting multiple vines with desirable traits, such as disease resistance, adaptation to local terroir, unique flavor profiles. And so you get more genetic diversity and resistance to disease. Tell me where I went wrong with that or whatever.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So the other thing that comes into that is that, okay, so you've made your planting, but over time, some vines die. So maybe they weren't as resilient for whatever reason. Maybe there was, some stressful circumstance. Some vines die, but usually, like with massal, the benefit is that many of them live. But in Argentina, we can manage phylloxera. So I won't say it doesn't exist, but we can manage phylloxera through the use of the irrigation system. So what we're able to do is grow the vines on their own feet. So no grafting and no North American rootstocks. So it's purely Malbec, but we can also take a cane, grow a long cane, and then grow it long enough that you can keep it attached to the mother, bury it in the ground about a foot deep, and then...
Do you mean the head of a cane, like you're bending it over?
Yeah, you take the whole cane, you lay it into the earth, and then you bring a shoot or two out of the ground. And the beauty of vines, and you can do this with any of the vines growing in your garden, is that every node, if it's buried, will root. People might have noticed that with ivy and things like that if it's near the earth, it'll start to grow roots. So a grapevine is the same. So you leave it attached to the mother plant. It gets the energy from the mother plant, but it's growing its own root system during that time. So it's not reliant upon, like with a nursery vine, there's like 4 inches of roots, which is almost nothing, and a very shallow root zone that it's buried in and all of that. Whereas this plant has the benefit of that huge engine of roots that the mother plant has. And then it can establish within about 2 years. And, at that time is when traditionally it was severed from the mother vine, but there are some people thinking about the idea of just leaving them all attached. But by doing that layering process, you're propagating the mixed DNA of the vineyard, right? And the most successful vines that are existing in the vineyard at a given time. It's really long-term thinking, but it is, kind of working with and culturing the most successful plants in the vineyard. And hopefully that goes along with wine quality. But what's really cool about the timing of our vineyard's existence is that in that sort of 1905 to 1925 period, well, there's two things, I guess. That was when there was the greatest genetic diversity amongst the Malbec plantings because they were still learning about it. And there were subsequently a couple of periods where the authorities felt that we needed to modernize and change to Syrah and Cabernet Sauvignon, things like that. So Malbec got pulled out. And so our vineyard reflects that time when genetic diversity was appreciated. The other thing is that in that 1920s period up until, say, the Great Depression, 1929, 1930 and onwards, Argentina was a wealthy country. People not only had the culture of enjoying great food and wine, but they had the money to promote that and to live a rich life. And they wanted their homegrown wines to reflect that. And so that's kind of the theme or the era in which the vineyard was planted, in order to make great wine. And so we were thrilled to be able to get something like that we could continue that legacy. Because even though, in Canada, we'd think, oh, if you got a vineyard planted in 1950, like that's old vines, right? But in that period in Argentina, it was a dictatorship and there were sanctions. So you couldn't ship wine outside the country anyway. And so production became very focused internally and more just as a beverage rather than as some cultural icon.
Yeah, because you're saying at that time, Argentina was the sixth richest nation in the world. So they were also testing and getting the best clones from wherever. Bordeaux, Malbec's one of the 5 original blending grapes for Bordeaux. So you've got these vines that come from that time, the best of everything. So let's also talk about the other Versado here, the Reserve, which I did pour out and decant because you said it has sediment.
Yeah. So, the 2014 Reserva, we've got a small stream of that wine coming into Ontario through our agent crew, and it's wine from our library. And, it's had the benefit of aging very comfortably in an underground cellar in Mendoza. And so over the years, it's thrown a fine sediment. We always recommend to stand the bottle upright for a few days and then open it, decant it off that sediment because the characteristics are much finer. The coarseness really does drop out with the sediment. And so that fineness is a reflection of elegance that happens over time in wine. So the tannins and some color will join together and fall out of the wine, but what it leaves you is something finer. So that's really what we're seeing in the 2014 at this stage in its life cycle. You just get a really elegant wine. That baby fat fruit, like the 2019 centenary vines, is showing still. That baby fat's gone, and it's all about the wine's life in bottle. So there's the fullness and the richness that originated from the grapes, but all of the characteristics are what we call tertiary, and that's a reflection of aging.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's very elegant, and you compare Malbec to Pinot, but I can see it coming through in the aged Versado. Are there other ways in which Malbec is like Pinot? Because I guess it's our experience with these liquid chocolate bars that you had referred to, Peter. I would never think of Malbec being like Pinot, but in what ways are they similar?
I would start with Malbec reflects terroir. Pinot is really famous for that, but so is Riesling and Malbec. And, unfortunately, in that world of J. Miller scores that were rewarding wines that had massive amounts of new wood and black color and, just really big, rich, and whether you want to call them, chocolate bars or chocolate cherry, those wines were being rewarded with high scores during that sort of early 2000s, and an international style was developing. And so there wasn't really an advantage for winemakers to show the differences between sites of where Malbec was grown. And the many people sort of fell into that international style. And that's where, what we love about Malbec is that reflection of terroir.
Absolutely. All right, we're going to move on to Leily so that we don't miss it, although there's so much more we could talk about with these wines. But let's move on to Leily in Niagara. Many wine lovers, admire the wines of Derek Burnett, and the Leily property has changed hands a few times, shifted to ice wine production at one point. But let's talk about how the new ownership, let me know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, of Fake Turkmen in 2021 has revitalized this historic and iconic property.
Yeah, so there's a backstory, and I'll let Peter get into that. But we were already working with Fike on his Stonebridge wines. And I guess a number of things came together that made it interesting to look at the Leily property. And so the chance to kind of bring that property back to its former reputation and fine wine production, that Donna and David Leily had worked for many years to accomplish. And certainly with the winemaking help of Derek Barnett and, Derek's passion for letting people know about all of his lovely wines. All of that was really intriguing to us. Do you want to talk about the Stonebridge connection and the whole process?
So Fike's initial project was with Stonebridge, and it's sort of in the middle of Niagara at 5th and 6th concessions and lines. And so right in the middle, removed from the moderation of the lake and of the river, and also in really, really slow soil. So super low cropping, really big intensity on the wines, good for production of lots of weight, lots of flavor. Small production, smaller berries as a rule, and really good flavor. Smaller berries give you a chance, for example, to have a greater skin component, particularly important within the reds, to juice component. So you're getting more of the color, more of the tannin, a little more depth and intensity, and wines that can be big, but because they're low cropped and in that particular area, the soils are quite complex, you're ending up with really interesting and complex flavors as well. So we liked that vineyard, and we liked the idea of working with that, and that's where it began. And we were looking at the prospect of building the winery there, a bit off the wine trail and sort of, I don't want to say in the middle of nowhere, but in the midst of things as opposed to precisely on the trails. And so a harder place to bring people with a small operation. And we heard through the grapevine, so to speak, that Leily was for sale and could be available. We knew the property well. I'd worked with Donna originally. She consulted for us viticulturally on the Stratus project because the soils there are similar to the Leily site. And knew Donna and David well and the wines well, and of course Derek, and thought has real potential and is a really good site right on the parkway. So good from a commercial point of view, and wanted to take advantage of being able to do that. Anyhow, the long story short, the price worked out to be something that would be positive. It seemed like a better idea with the price increases that had just taken place with COVID and the interruption of international shipping and the price of the winery construction going up. And so we took advantage of that and purchased Leily and began to combine the two operations. So both vineyards are still owned, and we work with the Leily vineyard and with the Stonebridge vineyard as well. So this is the Leily lineup that we've brought for tasting today.
Yeah, and Leily has or had 17 varieties, different grapes planted across 18 acres. Is that still going on at that much variety?
So, sadly, the intervening years with the other ownership weren't as good to the vineyards, and the 21-22 winter was pretty severe. And so not only were there some quality issues, I'll say, that we were concerned about in the vineyard before that, but also the winter injury meant that it was more, from a long-term perspective, practical to replant the vineyard. So we've kept many of the grape varieties that the Leilys had established there, but we've actually put them into bigger blocks. And then we're working with some, with each variety. So for example, we have Cabernet Sauvignon. We have 3 clones. We're working with 2 clones that we're really comfortable with, and we knew from existing planting at Leily and in Niagara. And then we've introduced a new clone into the block so that we've got something new to work with and something, to plan the future on.
including the Riesling.
Yeah, there's the Riesling.
Mhm.
So we're working with many of the same varieties. With the Riesling 22, this was the last of the old vines. So 22, even though we had winter injury and we lost a number of vines, we were able to make wine. So the 22s that we're tasting today are a look at sort of the last of the old vine plantings there.
That's very juicy and mouthwatering. It's got that stone fruit.
The thing that's fun about the Leily property is that it's a long, narrow vineyard and not necessarily the favorite of the tractor drivers because the rows are really short. But what's fun as a viticulturist is that it stretches from the eastern edge of the parkway. So with the Niagara River influence and the cool influences of that massive volume of flowing water, all the way to concession 1, so a mile away, where about halfway through the vineyard, the influences of the river dissipate. And so you're getting a warmer summertime temperature and cooler winter impact. You know, the climate's not uniform and the soils aren't uniform. They go from loamy sand to a heavier, more clay influenced soil. So there is a lot of opportunity to match varieties to soil differences and climate differences. So it's been a fun project that way to, really line things up with the soils and the temperatures.
That's awesome. And we've also got the Chardonnay. How would you compare and contrast Leily and On 7? They both make Chardonnay?
Yeah, and Stonebridge.
And Stonebridge,
They're,
okay.
definitely 3 points to a triangle in Niagara-on-the-Lake in terms of their location, but also the soil differences. So at Stonebridge, the soils are, as Peter mentioned, they're like super fine particles, lots of clay influence. Thankfully, it's well drained, but it's a very slow draining property with tons of mineral influence and low yields. And at On 7, it's sort of an intermediate soil. So, I wouldn't say that there's really any sand there, but there's a lot more loam in that soil. So it's just a little more farming friendly in that sense and just slightly more giving, but works, under the organic regime. And then at Leily, there is a more sand influence, but also the coolness of the river that's influencing it. So you get a little more vibrancy of character. I think the vines grow bigger and a little bushier at Leily. And, there's just a little more cool influence from all of that. And that's what I'm seeing in the reflection in all of these wines, a certain balance and elegance that just naturally pushes through.
Yeah, definitely. And still lots of energy. Just want to make sure I mentioned the Pinot Noir as well. How would you describe this one?
The Pinot Noir is, I'm getting often more fruit from the Leily property, more fruit forwardness. These Chardonnay and the Pinot were both barrel aged, wild fermented, like good 24 months in barrel. So the weight that you're seeing is after all of that aging. So, and the fruitiness that's kind of lifting up and kind of pushing through on these wines. So I think there's, a nice amount of complexity from their life in barrel, but there's always that vibrancy that's supporting it.
Yeah, I really like the tart cherry. It's nervy. It's energetic again. What are the goals now for Leily looking forward?
Well, certainly to keep the vineyard lots separate for the most part from Stonebridge, to keep the 2 lines of products and to welcome guests, whether they've been Leily fans all along or whether they're new discoveries, and to offer the lineups that reflect the vineyards. And so that fruity vibrancy and liveliness in the Leily wines, that will continue. And Stonebridge started out mostly Chardonnay focused, but new plantings have come on stream over the last 3 years. And so we've got Bordeaux Reds primarily that are coming from the property and, big full-bodied and very classically made wines.
A little bit of Syrah.
A very little bit. Looking forward to a bit more in the future. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting though to see just the vast difference between On 7 and Leily Chardonnays. I mean, they're both lovely in their own right, but they're very different expressions of the grape. So very nicely done. All right, before you expire here on me, because I know this has been a long conversation, what do you want to be remembered for? Top-notch wines, obviously, but what would you like your legacy to be in the Canadian wine industry?
I mean, for me, when I kind of reflect back, I see that, in the process of doing what we've been doing, which is working on new projects, introducing new winery owners to the business and to the culture of wine. And we've hired many people and worked with them and handed over the reins to many young people that are going to carry on in the wine industry. And so we've always looked for people with a lot of passion and commitment to be able to take over so we can move on to the next project, but also so that we know that what we've started is in good hands. And so I think that mentorship kind of reflects, but what we want to see, a healthy wine industry with a whole range of people, but also engaged consumers so that, we can keep doing it. And those people that we've brought along can also continue, many years into the future.
That's terrific. And what do you see are the greatest challenges or threats to the Canadian wine industry?
Yeah, I mean, again, from my perspective, it's something that we've been talking about for probably almost the 40 years that we've been making wine. And it's just, we want to figure out how to have lasting consumer engagement. So I know that, I'm speaking to the converted with your group, and we have a lot of devoted buyers, but we also know that kind of the monopoly culture is that, well, if you're the wine you were looking for today isn't on the shelf, you can buy something else. And, really promoting the message about buying directly from the wineries, as you mentioned earlier, and knowing that if you want to try that wine that's made in Nova Scotia or BC, that you actually can order it and have it shipped to your home province. Those interprovincial trade barriers aren't real. There's lots of wine shipping that's taking place already. So just get on your computer like you do with so many other products that you buy and buy online.
Absolutely. And whatever is left of those barriers are coming down day by day. There's new agreements all the time between the provinces. And, we hear it's going to be completely open by July 1st. But even if it's not, just go ahead and buy it online, anywhere, ship it anywhere. Do it. Support local farms across the country. Yeah, absolutely. So if you two were to plan your dream dinner party with three figures in the wine industry, who would they be?
Well, I'm going to say I'll do the cooking.
Oh, yes. Okay. So it's up to you, Peter, to, I don't know, invite the guests.
That sounded like a shift, didn't it?
Yeah. And so
I always like to stay on top of things that are happening and what's interesting in the wine industry now, and who's doing things that might be of interest in the areas that we're working. What's happening out there that might be a theory we can incorporate. We just got back from a trip to Europe, and in our usual method of combining things we'd like to see, like the Prado and Madrid and things like that, we stayed sort of halfway between there and the Gredos Mountains, where a group of really amazing winemakers, Commando G, Danny Landy, and some others, and Daniel Ramos have been working on some methods of producing wines that involve lesser macerations on the red, slightly lower alcohol, working at higher altitudes in their case in order to make more elegant wine, and just an elegantly different wine in terms of macerations, almost more steeped like a tea from a flavor perspective, sort of gentle flavorings as opposed to really rich, intense Michel Rolland-like or Parker-like levels of concentration. And so, we stay on top of that. I think having winemakers that are doing things interestingly in that regard are important. At Dobbin, we've incorporated, a lot of old theories as it relates to Riesling and not being one harvest, but being 7 harvests over a 7-week period, picking grapes even berry by berry as you get toward the end with for botrytic influence and things like that. So I think it would be a larger group, maybe, Natalie, that brought in people that were doing different things in different areas as it relates to wine and seeing how it all incorporated. A large part of what we want to do, and playing off Ann's comment about the future and the heritage of it going forward, has been working with the recognition that Niagara and British Columbia and Nova Scotia are all areas that are, very conducive to the production of fine wine. Most of the lesser wines coming, for example, from Ontario often aren't even coming from Ontario. They're blended wines that are, international blends being sent into our big bottlers and then maybe blended with a little bit of Ontario. Those are the less expensive wines. The wines that we can produce in those regions naturally are the kind of things we're doing at 3 tons an acre, 4 tons an acre. Very fine quality. They're parallels not with, the big volumes coming out of, Italy and Spain and California, but comparisons with the tiny regions like Burgundy, like Champagne, like Napa, where they're more expensive products. And so we work in that area, and we like to do as much as we can, to bring attention to those, very, very high quality artisan wines, to keep that part of the industry alive and healthy going forward, and to make sure that, some price points are there that can justify winemakers doing absolutely everything they can to make the finest possible wine from a vineyard.
Yeah, I'll raise my glass to that. Where can we find you both online and your wines? Do you have a website or social media?
So versadowine.com is Versado, and we can be connected through that. We actually don't have a website for our consulting business, but
You're too busy consulting.
It's part of our shtick. But we're on Facebook and Instagram, so you can find us there.
We'll put all the links again in the show notes. Thank you both for this. So appreciate, especially the extra time you've taken here to cover all these terrific wines. Well done. Thank you for what you've done for the Canadian wine industry, the amazing wines that you have produced, and also the culture of wine that you've spread. And as you say, the mentorship of bringing up a new generation across the country. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Leily.
All right. Cheers. So I'll say goodbye for now, and I look forward to continuing this conversation in person someday.
Okay.
Take care.
All right. Cheers.
Bye.
Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our chat with Ann and Peter. Here are my takeaways. Number 1, what makes old Malbec vines planted in the 1920s so rare and valuable today? As Ann and Peter explained, between 1905 and 1925 in Argentina, winemakers planted the greatest genetic diversity among Malbec vines because they were still learning about it. Then there were a couple of periods where the authorities felt they needed to modernize and change to Syrah and Cabernet Sauvignon, so Malbec got pulled out. Their Versado vineyard reflects a time when that genetic diversity was appreciated. As well, up to the Great Depression, Argentina was a really wealthy country, so people not only had a culture of enjoying great food and wine, but they also had the money to promote that and to live a rich life, and they wanted their homegrown wines to reflect that. Number 2, why would a Canadian winemaker, or two, head to Mendoza, Argentina to start a winery? Well, first, Peter was there on business with the VQA, negotiating with the world about quality standards for Canadian wine in order to be accepted for trade purposes. He visited a lot of wine regions in the world for meetings, both fun and out of necessity. One of them was Mendoza. He loved the climate, the fact that it's cold at night, with a cool wind coming down off the glaciers in the mountains, and then it can be 35 degrees during the day. So a really interesting climate from his perspective for creating flavors and grapes. And he liked the lifestyle. They're largely Italian and Spanish in influence. Then Anne was invited down as part of a French winemaking consultation team and spent time there and also loved it. That's when they decided it would be interesting to do something small, boutique, that gave them a second harvest during New Year's. These are not people who like to rest. So they can practice twice as often was their rationale. That was the driver, as well as the potential quality there. And number 3, what is one of the biggest challenges holding back Canadian wine, and how can consumers like us change that? Peter and Ann have been talking about this issue for 40 years while they've been making wine, how to have lasting consumer engagement and loyalty. They do have a lot of devoted buyers, but they also know that if the wine you're looking for isn't on the shelf, you can just buy something else. So that means you're often overlooking small boutique wineries. Promoting the message of buying directly from these wineries And, if you want to try a wine that's made in Nova Scotia or BC or Ontario, Quebec, wherever, you can actually order it and have it shipped to your doorstep. Those interprovincial trade barriers aren't real, they say. And I have to agree. In reality, you can ship anything anywhere. There's lots of wine being shipped back and forth already. And with the new leadership in government, let's hope that just continues and all the barriers officially come down. As they say, just get on your computer like you do with so many other products that you buy online and order yourself some wine. In the show notes, you'll find the full transcript of my conversation with Ann and Peter, links to their website and to the websites of the wineries mentioned so that you can order directly from them, the video versions of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live, and where you can order my book online now no matter where you live. If you missed episode 75, go back and take a listen. I chat about Niagara's present and future with winemaking pioneer Klaus Reif. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite.
Good wine is, in my opinion, has the right balance, the harmony. I always compare like a musician, an orchestra. You have an amazing piano player. You have an amazing trumpet player or a drum player. But if they're out of tune, it's horrible. That's what I try to accomplish with the wine, to bring all elements together to play in harmony.
That's a great analogy, Klaus, because even if they're in tune, but if the piano is dominating the whole orchestra, it's not as beautiful as it could be with all the elements in harmony, and you don't go, oh, there's that trombone again. Everything has to work together so that there's this greater sense of the whole, or the piece of music, or the wine, than you would get with just a solo by one instrument. I like that. You won't want to miss next week when we chat with Amy Wislocki, editor-in-chief of Decanter, the world's most prestigious wine magazine. She'll be joining us from her office in London, England, to chat about her new book, The Ultimate Travel Guide for Wine Lovers. She has so many great tips. Get ready to create your bucket list, or should I say your spittoon list. If you liked this episode or learned even one thing from it, please email or tell one friend about the podcast this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in learning more about Niagara and Argentine wines. It's easy to find the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. Just tell them to search for Natalie McLean Wine on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, their favorite podcast app, or they can listen to the show on my website at nataliemclean.com/podcast. Email me if you have a sip, tip, question, or would like to win one of 6 copies of the books we have to give away. Of course, I'd also love to hear your thoughts on this episode, or if you've read my book or are listening to it. Email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com. In the show notes, you'll also find a link to take a free online food and wine pairing class with me called The 5 Wine and Food Pairing Mistakes That Can Ruin Your Dinner, and how to fix them forever at nataliemclean.com/class. And that's all in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/343. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Perhaps an Old Vines Malbec. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So subscribe for free now at nataliemclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.